In this module, I'd like to continue our discussion of the kingdom fungi. So you may recall that the kingdom fungi are within the superkingdom Uniconta. And we talked a little bit about hyphae and mycelia last time. And so I'd like to continue just kind of some general characteristics of fungi. And one is that in the life cycles of fungi, and part of how we actually classify fungi is based upon the kinds of spores that they form and the sporangia that they produce. So again, we've used the term spore previously. A spore then would be a cell that has a heavy cell wall around it, some kind of protective layer around it. Spores usually can tolerate drying out, desiccation, sometimes heat and so on. And then under the right conditions, they'll germinate. They'll begin to undergo mitosis and regenerate a new fungus. But spore is just kind of a generic term, but we certainly use it here. And depending on the type of fungus, we may be looking at haploid spores, diploid spores, or dikaryotic spores. We're going to be looking at fairly simple life cycles, though, so we'll be talking mostly about haploid, diploid conditions. Now, also, the sporangium then would be the structure that produces spores. And again, a lot of how fungi are classified is the type of sporangium they produce and the type of spores that they produce. So looking at an example of this in this diagram here, this would be a sporangium. You can see there's some little tiny specks that are generated there, and those tiny specks that are eventually released are the spores. And then under the right conditions, the spores can tolerate hostile conditions basically, and then under the right conditions, they will germinate and produce new hyphae. Okay, so let's go ahead then and look at some of the divisions of the kingdom fungi that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And we'll talk about some of the life cycles as well, kind of generic life cycles for these. Now, the first group are the Chytridiomycota. And the Chytridiomycota are a primitive group of fungi. We're not really going to talk much about the life cycle here, but what they're trying to tell us in their name, the suffix mycota is a reference to fungus. The prefix chytridio means pot, so these are so-called pot fungi. And so they produce sporangia that are kind of pot-like, just kind of spherical sporangia that will rupture and disseminate spores. And the significance in the Yellowstone ecosystem of the Chytridiomycota is that they are implicated in part of what's a global epidemic of a pathogenic Chytridiomycotin, which is really creating problems for amphibians all over the world. So there is a crash, basically, of amphibian populations all around the world. The Yellowstone ecosystem is not immune to that problem. And again, one of the problems, there are a few problems targeting amphibians. We'll talk more about this when we get to amphibians later in the semester. But some of the problems involve ultraviolet radiation, but also the Chytridiomycota. So again, there's this pathogenic parasitic chytrid, which is formed an epidemic around the world, a pandemic, and it does kill amphibians. So it causes problems with their skin. The skin is really important for gas exchange with frogs, as you might imagine. And so anyway, it's potentially lethal to them. So this is an example of a frog that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem, the boreal chorus frog. And again, all amphibians are at some risk from Chytridiomycota, including the Yellowstone ecosystem. Okay, now another group of fungi that we see really globally, but also in the Yellowstone ecosystem, are the Zygomycota. And here they're named for the fact that they produce a large sporangium known as a zygosporangium, derived from a zygote. And so typically when we talk about fungi, we're looking at soil, and especially in the Yellowstone ecosystem, there are aquatic fungi as well, but we're going to be focusing primarily on the soil fungi. And you may recall also that fungi are either pathogenic or, for the most part, saprobes, decomposers. So anyway, what happens in the sexual phase, and I'm focusing on the sexual phases of these fungi, is that in the sexual phase you'll have hyphae of two genetic types. And so those are just kind of arbitrarily assigned plus and minus types. And if the hyphae of two different types of genetic mycelia encounter one another, then what will happen is that hyphae will grow towards one another. So the genetically different hyphae will grow towards one another. And eventually those hyphae will fuse. Now, this particular group does not, or in this particular example, it does not undergo a dikaryotic phase. So they will go ahead and immediately, those haploid nuclei will fuse, and that forms a diploid cell. And so then the cell begins to enlarge, and this large structure that is produced from this cell is known as a zygosporangium. So it's derived from the zygote. You may recall when haploid gametes fuse, that's known as a zygote, and then the organism can be produced from that zygote. And so anyway, that's referred to as a zygote sporangium because the two haploid nuclei fuse to form a diploid cell, and that's just called the zygote here. So anyway, that will enlarge. It eventually becomes quite large. The nucleus will undergo meiosis, producing spores, so haploid spores are produced. The zygosporangium is typically very dark, kind of blackish looking. And again, the spores will be, haploid spores will be produced through meiosis inside of that. And eventually that zygosporangium ruptures and the zygospores are released. They'll hopefully make it through hard times and then eventually germinate and grow into new hyphae. So here's a slide showing us actually kind of different phases of this development. Here we have a couple of the haploid hyphae growing towards one another, and we refer to these hyphae that are haploid growing towards one another as suspensor cells, also called gametangia. And then they will fuse together. So we're looking right here where they're just fusing and the zygosporangium is just beginning to form. We see some different phases where the zygosporangium is in different phases of developing. And then within that, again, meiosis would occur, and then we can see here a ruptured zygosporangium, and the spores have been disseminated. So most of the zygosporangia form different types of molds. Black bread mold is an example here. The genus Rhizopus is an example of the zygosporangia. Now, another major division of fungi that we see throughout the Yellowstone ecosystem, and these are macroscopic, in some situations, are the Basidiomycota. And so the Basidiomycota, what the name is trying to tell us is that these are fungi that produce club-like sporangia. So these are the club fungi, and so the sporangia are reminiscent of a club, and we'll look at an example of that in a second. Examples of Basidiomycota are mushrooms, and we see lots of mushrooms up in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Puffballs, we'll see this up there as well. And I don't know if you've ever seen puffballs, but they have a little pore at the top, and if you were to squeeze them, it looks like smoke's coming out, but these would be the spores that are produced as part of their reproductive cycle. And then also bracket fungi that we typically see growing on trees and so on would also be members of the Basidiomycota. So in the Basidiomycota, again, it's kind of similar to the previous life cycle in that you're going to have soil hyphae, soil mycelia, of different genetic types, and these would be haploid. And again, when they detect a different genetic type, they'll grow towards one another, and they'll fuse together. And then those hyphae then continue to grow, but we'll end up with a dikaryotic hypha being produced, or a dikaryotic mycelium will be produced. And so then this will grow into a structure. So it's this dikaryotic hypha, or hyphae rather, that will form a mycelium, and these mycelia will have shape. So it may grow into a puffball, it may grow into the bracket fungus that you see, or it also may grow into the mushroom. So when you're looking at a mushroom, what you're looking at is a mycelium of dikaryotic hyphae. And instead of kind of cottony looking moldy like mycelium, it's a compressed mycelium. So the different hyphae are all compacted together. But really this is a reproductive structure. So normally, again, the hyphae are growing in the soil, but when they find a mate in effect, they fuse, form dikaryotic hyphae, and those dikaryotic hyphae then form the mushroom. So we call the mushroom a basidiocarp. The cap is called the pileus. And then eventually gills will form on the undersurface of the mushroom. We call those lamellae. And so that's really where the next phase of the life cycle takes place. But the point is that all of this tissue is dikaryotic, except for along the gills on the undersurface of the mushroom. So again, as the pileus, as the cap forms, it will open up. And then again, hopefully you've seen mushrooms where you see the gills underneath. I don't really have a good picture of that. Anyway, what happens along the gills then is that the sporangia will form. And so initially the sporangia are dikaryotic. They'll be an N plus N condition. And then within those cells, the nuclei will fuse to form a diploid basidiosporangium. And then it will immediately undergo meiosis and present the spores along the surface of the sporangium. And so again, we refer to this as the basidiosporangium. And so again, this is occurring along the gills of the mushroom. And so here's a micrograph looking at one of the gills of a mushroom. And then these are the basidiosporangia with the basidiospores, the haploid spores along the edges of the gills. And here's a slightly larger magnification. And again, here would be the basidiosporangium, and it's produced the spores up above. So the spores then come loose, and again, I don't know if you've ever seen a mushroom grow to this point, but if you tap on kind of a dried out mushroom, again, it kind of looks like smoke comes out of the gills, and those are the spores being released. And so the spores will be disseminated, can get through bad times, and eventually, if the conditions are right, then those spores will germinate and grow into new haploid hyphae in the soil. And so again, we don't really realize it, but there's an incredible biomass of fungi growing in the soil. And one of the largest organisms ever discovered on Earth actually occurs in Oregon, and it's an Basidiomycota, and it covers at least 2,200 acres. So what has happened is that researchers have sampled different soil over quite a large range, and they have done DNA fingerprints of the fungi that they find there, and it's genetically identical. So the hyphae are produced through mitosis. So that's an asexual type of reproduction. So as these hyphae have grown, they've continued to grow through the soil in this area, and like I said, cover about 2,200 acres, and an incredible biomass there. And we only see evidence of them when they go into a sexual phase, producing the mushrooms. So that's the only time we're really aware that they're there. So in the Yellowstone ecosystem, again, there's quite a few mushrooms there. Some of the common genera are Agaricus, also Boletus, and Coprinus would be some of the common species there. And the thing about mushrooms that you really have to be careful of, and up in the Yellowstone ecosystem, there are some massive mushrooms up there, and I believe this is the genus Boletus, but this is bigger than my hands. They're really large mushrooms, and so you'll see birds and squirrels and so on feeding on the mushrooms. And I know that there's always a temptation to eat mushrooms, and there are edible mushrooms, but there are a lot of highly poisonous mushrooms, and so you have to be extremely careful if you like to be a mushroomer, if you like to eat mushrooms, because I went to school in Northern California. I was always reading in the paper about whole families sometimes getting wiped out because they went out mushrooming, collecting wild mushrooms, and then eating them and then dying. And you really have to be experienced and know what you're doing. We have a ranger friend that we know pretty well up in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and he told us about a ranger that he knows that they know pretty well, and he was invited to go out mushrooming with this fellow ranger. He declined the invitation, and then 3 days later, the ranger called him, just kind of croaking, barely audible on the phone, and said, I've been blacked out. What day is it? He didn't know what day it was. He basically had eaten these poison mushrooms, started hallucinating, very nearly died, but did manage to survive, eating bad mushrooms. And this was a person that was highly experienced. So you just don't take any chances with mushrooms. If you don't know for sure that they're an edible variety, leave them be and move on. Okay, our last division of fungi that we're going to consider are the Ascomycota. And the Ascomycota, here the word is trying to tell us that they are the sac fungi. But they also typically form cup-like structure, bear the sporangia on cup-like structures, so they're also known as the cup fungi. And again, some examples would be truffles, would be examples of Ascomycota, also morels. Some morels are edible Ascomycota. And again, along the surface of the morels, you can see that there are these cup-like structures. And also in this group would be the yeasts. Yeasts are unicellular fungi, the only unicellular fungi. And so again, we find yeast throughout the ecosystems, but we're going to focus on the multicellular forms. And again, looking at the multicellular forms, again, we can see these cup-like structures that always tell us when we see those, we know we're dealing with an Ascomycota. So in the life cycle here, again, the Ascomycota would be typically our soil mycelia, although we'll talk about some exceptions to that later. Again, the different genetic types, the plus and minus types, will detect one another. They'll grow together. They'll form a dikaryotic hypha. And then that will grow into some kind of a structure. And again, that could be the morel, that could be the truffle, but usually it will have some kind of a cup-like structure associated with it. We refer to that as the ascocarp. So again, the morel is the ascocarp, and again, a cup-like feature associated with that. Same thing here. And so then it will be along these cup-like features where we will actually have the presentation of the sporangia. And so it's similar to what we talked about before. And so again, this is looking at one of the cups, and these would be the sporangia along the surface of the cup. And so again, it would start with a dikaryotic cell. The nuclei would fuse to form a diploid cell. And then within that diploid cell, the cell will elongate, and then meiosis will occur, and we'll end up with haploid spores. So we refer to this sac-like structure as the ascosporangium. Sometimes it's just called the ascus or sac. And then within that, we'll have the ascospores. And sometimes a round of meiosis or two may occur within the ascosporangium, so you may end up with multiple spores in that. So it's usually multiples of 4. And then eventually the ascosporangium will rupture, the ascospores are disseminated, and eventually can grow into new fungi, new hyphae. So again, looking at the surface of one of the cups, those are where the sporangia are. Closer look, these are the ascosporangia. We can see the ascospores within, ascosporangium, ascospores within. They'll rupture, spores are disseminated. So again, mostly soil organisms, although we will see them in lichens, which we'll talk about in a second. We also do see one genus at least, Curvularia, that we find in some of the hot springs, and they prefer a temperature of less than 131 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, we do find some at least one genus of fungi growing in the hot springs. Also, within the Ascomycota in particular, we do find some what we call imperfect fungi. So this isn't really a division or an official taxonomic group, but the term imperfect fungi just refers to fungi for which we have not identified a sexual phase yet. And we don't know if they really don't have one or if they have one and we just haven't observed it yet. So some examples are Penicillium and Aspergillius. Now, the next superkingdom then I want to get into is the superkingdom Plantae. And members of the superkingdom Plantae are photosynthetic, and so they'll practice plant-like photosynthesis. They will have a cell wall of some type. They are generally multicellular. Most have tissues, although not all. And they practice something called alternation of generations. And we'll discuss that when we get to the true plants in a couple of minutes. So within the superkingdom Plantae, then some of the kingdoms here, one kingdom would be the superkingdom Rhodophyta. And the Rhodophyta is a reference to the red algae. The common name here is the red algae. Prefix rhodo means red. Ophyta is a reference to plants, so the red plants or the red algae. So the Rhodophyta we normally associate with marine organisms. So most Rhodophyta are marine organisms, red algae. But there are a few Rhodophyta that have been found in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and some of those are associated with lichens, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But again, they have a different set of accessory pigments than the true plants will have, and that's what results in their kind of reddish coloration. Another kingdom are the Chlorophyta. The prefix chloro is a reference to green, ophyta to plants. And to be honest with you, this kingdom has been split up into some sub-kingdoms or other kingdoms, to be honest with you, but we're going to kind of keep these lumped together. But this is a group that are known as the green algae. So again, they have a set of accessory pigments that are much more like the true plants. And again, most of the green algae that we find in Yellowstone ecosystem are what we call filamentous green algae. So they grow, much like the hyphae do of fungi, so they'll grow in filaments. And we find these, again, throughout the ecosystem. You'll find them in ponds, you'll find them in slow-moving streams, even along the banks of rivers. And there are a couple of varieties that will live in the hot springs, and they prefer a temperature of less than 140 degrees, but when you see some of the greenish portions in the hot springs, those are typically filamentous chlorophyta, filamentous green algae. And again, there's some colonial forms of green algae as well in this group. Now, before we get to the true plants, the Euplantae, I want to talk about lichens. And lichens, taxonomically, in terms of classification, don't really fit well anywhere, because lichens, although they look like an organism, are not an organism per se. Lichens are a composite, a mutualistic relationship between some kind of fungus and some type of algae, or in some cases, instead of a eukaryotic algae like the red algae or the green algae, they may actually have, the fungi may have a symbiotic relationship with a eubacterium, the cyanobacterium. So again, as we look at lichens, they'll look like an organism, but they're not an organism per se. It's actually a mass of fungal and algal cells that are living cooperatively in a mutualistic way, a mutually beneficial way, composing of a fungus of some type and either an algae, most typically Rhodophyta or some type of Chlorophyta, or a cyanobacterium. So there's going to be some member here that is photosynthetic. So the algae and cyanobacteria are photosynthetic. So if there's sunlight, they can photosynthesize, produce sugars. And then also the fungi here can have a couple of different roles. They're heterotrophic. So again, if sunlight is not very good, they can consume organic material. Also, fungi can secrete digestive enzymes, and they can be bringing in food to the relationship that way if they're growing on dead or decaying vegetation, for example. And then also fungi can also secrete acidic compounds, which can break down rock. And there may be nutrients available in the rock in some cases, and that will help both the algae and the fungi in this situation. So they both benefit from this relationship generally. So this is a cross-section of what a lichen looks like. And so again, most of the lichen is composed of a hypha. So as we look at this, most of it is a hypha. The red spots that you're seeing, those are the individual algae. And then again, we are looking at, in some cases, we're seeing a cup-like structure here. So when we see a cup-like structure, that's telling us that this particular fungus would be an Ascomycota. And the typical fungi here that we see are most typically Ascomycota or Basidiomycota. So what's interesting in this lichen relationship is that the fungi do hang on to some of their characteristics, and they will actually produce sporangia and spores in most cases. And so a lot of the lichens that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem, we will see the cup-like structures. That tells us that the fungal component here is an Ascomycota. And again, if you go up on high power there, you'll find the ascosporangia with the ascospores within. So again, most of this is a fungal hypha. Kind of the dark round cells would be and are different types of algae. So it will be a specific species of fungus with a specific species of algae or cyanobacteria. So when we look at lichens, we can just kind of generally categorize them. Again, this wouldn't really be a classification per se, but when we go to the Yellowstone ecosystem, we observe what we call crustose lichens, and we see these growing on rocks. And crustose lichens literally are that. They look kind of crusty looking. So again, the fungus here will break down the rock, help free up nutrients that benefit not only them, but also the algae, which are photosynthesizing. Fruticose lichens are kind of shrubby looking, branch looking, and many of these are saprobes. We'll find them decomposing plants and so on. And then also foliose lichens are kind of leafy looking lichens, and we do observe some of these in the Yellowstone ecosystem as well. And most of these leafy types also you'll find basically decomposing vegetation. So some common lichens that we find up in the Yellowstone ecosystem, freckled pelt, genus Peltigeria. There are different types of pixies, several genera or several species up there within the genus Cladonia. Something that we find hanging from the trees, a couple of types, witch's hair in the genus Alectoria, and then also kind of a black one that is similar to the witch's hair we call horsehair, and that's Bryoria is the genus. So again, we see lots of these up in the Yellowstone ecosystem, both crustose and other varieties. Okay, so that then brings us to our final kingdom within the superkingdom Plantae, and that is the Euplantae, the so-called true plants. And of course, the Yellowstone ecosystem is loaded with members of the Euplantae. So all of the conifers, all of the flowering plants that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem, mosses, are all members of the Euplantae. And they are a dominant portion of this terrestrial ecosystem. And we'll talk about a number of different varieties. So again, and as far as the food chain is concerned, they're the photosynthetic organisms. They're producing the food that the consumers will feed on. So members of the Euplantae are photosynthetic. They are all multicellular, truly multicellular. They have cell walls composed of cellulose. Now, they may have some other compounds added in, as we'll talk about later, but they will always have cellulose. And they also have well-developed tissues. So again, this is what distinguishes them from the quote-unquote algae, such as the red algae and the green algae, as having these well-developed tissues. And then also they will practice something called alternation of generations. So alternation of generations is something we see throughout the plants, and we're going to come back to this many times. So I'm going to go through a quick overview, and then we'll come back to this. But what they do is they alternate between a haploid generation of plant and a diploid generation of plant. And so the haploid plant is known as a gametophyte. The gametophyte will produce structures, an antheridium and an archegonium. The antheridium is a structure that will produce sperm of some type. The archegonia will produce ova of some type. As we talk about different types of plants, the sperm has to get to the ovum somehow. That may be through swimming. So some plants require water for fertilization. Other plants will use pollen. And again, we'll define this as we work through the division here. But sperm make their way to the ovum. They'll fertilize the ovum. When they fertilize the ovum, that forms a zygote. And recall that the zygote is a diploid cell. So we have gone then from a parent organism, a plant that's haploid, producing a diploid cell, which is the zygote. Then the zygote will mitotically divide, and it will grow into a new plant, and that new plant is called a sporophyte. And the sporophyte is a diploid plant. So if you look at the names again, the gametophyte, the word means a plant that produces gametes. So the gametophyte is going to produce a structure called an antheridium that generates sperm, an archegonium that produces ova. When sperm and egg fuse, that forms a zygote. As the zygote grows into a plant, we call that plant a sporophyte plant. So here we're looking at a plant that is going to produce spores. And it will produce sporangia of some type, and we've seen that term before. And the sporangia will, within the sporangia, meiosis will occur. And in plants, they will produce haploid spores. So the diploid generation then is the sporophyte generation. The gametophyte is the haploid generation. And under the right conditions then, those spores will undergo mitosis and grow into a new plant, which is the gametophyte plant. So even though we're not aware of all of these stages by looking at plants, plants do alternate between a gametophyte offspring and diploid offspring, if you will. And that's very different than our own kind of life cycle. Now, the other thing, too, I want to mention is when we talk about spores in plants, when we talk about plant spores, they're always haploid. They're haploid spores. And you might also wonder, then, how is a spore different from a sperm or an ovum? Because those are haploid, too. Sperm and ova can fuse to form a zygote. Spores do not. They undergo mitosis to produce a new gametophyte. I'll be talking about this more in future modules, but that does it for today.